All right. And I'm live. So how does the full moon actually affect us? Well, the full moon does have a significance in astrology, as far as how it affects the psyche and um, in a general way, right? But there's also infinite nuance within which within that framework, because it depends astrologically on where the moon is in our birth chart and what area of the chart the moon is in at that current time, and it's going to uh, it's going to change signs, change houses with every full moon. It's going to be in the next sign, in the next house in your birth chart. And it's going to be affecting you in a way that has a progressive uh, quality to it, because the signs and the houses have this evolutionary quality to them. So, for example, every sign uh, evolves into the next in a way in which that next sign has something that the sign before it lacked. But in doing so, in making that change, it's often a drastic one. It's overcompensating for the thing that the sign before it lacked. So, for example, Aries evolves into Taurus. That's the first sign of the zodiac, Aries, into the second. Uh, on the general level, Aries is characterized by being a very fast-moving planet. Has a lot of physical energy and has a need to exert that energy, to put it outward. Taurus looks at Aries and says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You're too much, right? You're too impulsive. You're not thinking before you act. You're not, preparing. You're just acting. You're just reacting, we could say." And so Taurus overcompensates for that by being too slow. Taurus is the slowest sign of the zodiac. It's the most stable. It's the first of the fixed signs, so it has a fixed quality to it, in all aspects, in terms of what it values, in terms of how it thinks, in terms of how it exerts physical energy. Because Aries and Taurus are both very physically energetic signs, styles of expression. And Taurus doesn't just give up that physical energy by evolving out of Aries. It just does something different with that energy, the opposite thing. Whereas Aries is always putting that energy out, Taurus is trying to contain it. So Taurus, whereas Aries gets a bad rap for being too impulsive, too fast moving, Taurus has the opposite criticism, that it's too slow, that it's too fixed in its ways, that it doesn't act with enough impulsivity, because sometimes impulsivity can be good. Aries people, for example, are overrepresented in the ADHD population. People who have ADHD tend to have Aries placements, or some heavy Aries emphasis. I'm not saying that all of them do, or that even most of them do, but there is an Aryan quality to that mental health condition, because it's a very impulsive planet. And then Taurus, on the other hand, would represent things at its lower vibration, again, like reluctance to change, let's say adaptation anxiety, or anxiety surrounding change, surrounding transitions, things like that. So there's this evolutionary quality with the signs, and so it is the case that the houses are sort of the same way, although signs and houses are two very different things, right? Signs are styles of expression for the planets that are in those signs. Planets being the parts of yourself, the parts of your psyche, parts of your perception. The houses represent contexts of life, areas within which whatever planets are contained within them represent. So if you don't have any planets in the fourth house of home and home grounding and the role within the home and a relationship to family members, then it follows that you just don't place a lot of conscious value on the topics of that house, of family and what role you play in the home and what your relationship to family members is. So you tend to live somewhere far away from your family or from where you grew up, because you don't just place a lot of conscious value on that thing. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It depends on how you manage it, live far away from your family if that's what you're going to do, because that's what you need. Not because you're running from anything, trying to escape from, any problems that you had in the home that you haven't dealt with, right? Changing scenery physically isn't going to help if you're not doing the inner work required to actually solve those problems, right? And so astrology in general doesn't give us an escape. It doesn't give us greener pastures to escape to that aren't really any greener. It actually helps us to face reality within ourselves, within our own perceptions, and face what difficulties we're naturally predisposed to running into in life, so that we can more consciously own the decisions that we make. It's not an escape, it's quite the opposite. But it can be used for evil, and the evildoers use it for those purposes of escapism and validation of one's own delusions about oneself and the world, right? So, taking some of my beer here. It's full moon day. So, like any other planet in astrology, the moon progresses through the signs, through the houses. And with every phase, it's trying to improve on the things that came before it. The moon's progressing through the signs and the houses in your birth chart as to try to find reconciliation for the problems that the sign before it or the house before it contains or produces within the psyche. So the first thing that you have to do to know, how the moon phases affect you is to know how your signs and houses are aligned in your birth chart, so that you know where in your birth chart the moon actually is. And that requires you to know what your ascendant sign is. And that requires you to know what time you were born. Ideally, exactly, but sometimes that's too much of an ask. If you have it within a few minutes, that's good. It's the most ideal thing I can reasonably ask for as an astrologer. There are rectification methods through counseling and inquiry. We can try to figure out from a psychological, perceptive, and behavioral perspective where your ascendant might be. But there's nothing like having the actual birth time, because really the rectification part of astrology, it can't be fully validated unless we have that actual birth time, So you have to have your birth time to know how your houses and signs are aligned in your birth chart, so that you know which parts of your chart, and therefore which areas of life the moon is entering into at any given point and causing you to reflect on. Because that's what the moon does when it enters a new part of your birth chart. The things, the topics of that part of your birth chart, let's say it's the seventh house. Seventh house is about connection, one-on-one, you as an individual with another person who's an individual, connecting, finding common ground, or not. It's about marriage. It's about partnership. It's about contractual agreements. It's about negotiation. All right. If the moon is in that part of the birth chart, you're going to have a reflective pre-concern with those kinds of things. So if there's a full moon in your seventh house, those are literally the kinds of topics that might keep you up at night. Because the full moon, we could say, is the peak of the lunar cycle. So a lunar cycle begins with a new moon. That's why they call it the new moon. Okay. And the new moon is not illuminated at all. It starts from scratch. It starts from nothing. It starts with no light, literally, when we look at it. And then little by little, the sun and the moon form a relationship over the course of the month, so that over the next 2 weeks, the moon gets more and more illuminated, from the crescent phases to the half moon phase, all the way to the full moon phase 2 weeks later. And then that's the waxing period, and the moon starts to wane. Okay. So there's this buildup from the new moon to the full moon. And the full moon represents the peak of that lunar phase where the moon is fully illuminated. Now, the theme of that particular phase is going to be determined by, both personally and generally, by where the new moon begins. So, generally speaking, regardless of your birth chart, there are going to be themes that the reflective part of the mind, the part that responds with emotion and reaction. Emotions are reactions, technically speaking. They're predisposed reactions based on our brain chemical levels. The style of the planet, the style of the sign that the new moon occurs in is the same as the sun. So if you've ever met someone who has sun conjunct moon in their birth chart, their sun and moon are in the same sign. Now, that person has a very clear perception for what their intentions are. They take a very simple-minded approach to making decisions. Because they're doing so. They're thinking deeply about things, that's the moon, and they are acting and exerting their energy outwardly, that's the sun, in the same style, because those two parts of them, their psyches, are in the same sign. So they have a very simple approach to making decisions, to taking action, things like that. Okay, like important stuff. Doesn't mean they're right or wrong any more often than anyone else. It just means that they think less deeply about the decisions they make on average than someone who, say, has sun opposite moon. That's another thing. We'll get to that. So we want to think about the moon phases in terms of the aspects to the sun. Okay. And when you have a new moon, it's implied that the sun and the moon are in a conjunction. They're right together in the same sign, in the same house. When there's a full moon, the moon is opposite the sun. So there's a very shadow revealing, from a Jungian perspective, effect that the psyche is having to deal with, right? So the ego and the source of energy and vitality, the sun, the sense of identity, is in opposition, in conflict with, is playing a game of tug of war with the deeper mind. That's the moon. How we more deeply think about things, process things, reflect. Okay. And so when someone has this aspect in their birth chart, and I like to describe general things like what does a full moon mean within the context first of having us understand a birth chart aspect, because birth chart astrology is fundamental in understanding anything else about astrology. If we do not understand our own birth chart and ourselves, we have very limited capacity to understand things outside of ourselves. That's true not just in astrology, but in life. Okay. It's one of the big symbols and analogies we can make from astrology that relates to all aspects of life, is that we have to understand our own birth chart before we can understand the general themes and concepts in astrology that may have an effect on everyone, but again, in a personal way. This full moon that we're dealing with right now, that it's about to go conjunct in about an hour, by the way. I don't know if I'll still be online by then. Maybe we will, and we'll see what happens. But we have to know ourselves before we understand what that means. And but still, it's going to be very personal for everyone. The general meaning of it, regardless of our own involvement and conception of it, has very limited application, right? So anyway, when someone has sun opposite moon in their birth chart, meaning they were born under a full moon, they have the opposite problem or the opposite situation to the new moon, the sun conjunct moon person. Whereas that person takes a very simple approach to thinking and decision making, taking action, exerting their energy. The opposition has a very complicated back and forth between two extremes, overthinking way of balancing every single decision that they make. Every single thought has an angel on one shoulder, a devil on the other shoulder. Okay. And these people can be crippled into indecision. It's a tough placement to have. Sun opposite moon in the birth chart in a tight orb. Orb being how far away from exactly 180 degrees it is. The orb refers to the degree of separation, the degree level of separation from 180. So when you're talking about a square, that's a 90 degree aspect between two planets. The orb, a 2-degree orb, would mean it's 92 or 88 degrees. So the tighter the orb is, the closer to the exactly 180 degrees the sun and the moon are, the more the person is going to feel that kind of teeter-totter effect in every decision that they make, in every thought that they think, and every feeling that they feel. It's a constant battle of tug of war between the emotional and processing part of the self that is first reacting, but then also trying to process more deeply once the dust settles. And then the ego, the sun, that just wants what it wants, the person's sense of self, the person's sense of identity that is like already decided what it is, for better or for worse. So that's how those aspects, those lunar phase aspects show up in the birth chart. Talking about conjunction, new moon between the sun and the moon, and then opposition between the sun and the moon is the full moon. So that's what we're dealing with right now in a full moon, is a tug of war effect between emotion and processing over here, and ego and sense of identity and vitality over here. Now, you have to know how this is actually affecting your birth chart to know what is the significance between what is the significance of this particular full moon So the sun is in Leo, and the moon is in Aquarius. Those are opposite signs. So let's talk about that. Leo is the biggest ego of the zodiac, of all the personalities of the zodiac, we could say. Someone who has their sun in Leo means that their sun's energy is amplified by uh, by the Leo expression, and they tend to have the biggest egos of the zodiac, for better and for worse. It's not a bad thing to have a big ego if you know how to manage it, and it's not a good thing to have a small ego if you don't know how to manage it. So I'm not giving Leo sun people a bad rap by saying that they have the biggest egos. It's just a psychological fact that astrology can prove. Okay. Um, so they're hyper concerned with themselves, with their own self image, with their own way of projecting their energy, their creativity, their sense of realness and stability. Leo sun person cannot help but to shit test you. Again, for better and for worse. I've dealt with some Leo women before, and they're very direct when it comes to testing your manhood or testing your manliness, you know? And Leo men are the same way with women. They're very testy with women, and they like to leave it all out on a plate for you to take or leave. But ultimately, their egos can be hurt. They have huge hearts, and they do want to be the decider of whether or not that relationship continues or is pursued at all. They are the lion or the lioness in the jungle of the astrological jungle, and they want to do the hunting. Okay, so I can only speak on the most general and detached level possible when I talk about what does it mean for us to be in Leo sun season. Well, it depends. What is the sun lighting up in your chart right now? It's going to be an area of your chart that's very visible. So look at your birth chart, see where Leo is, which house that Leo covers, especially the cusp, which house cusp Leo is on, if any. Because if you use a quadrant house system like I do, then it may be intercepted. But that is going to be the area of life. That house that Leo covers, that's going to be the area of life that is of most conscious concern to you during Leo season, Leo sun season. Okay. It is going to light up the things of that house. It's going to say, hey, this shit exists, right? So if you have Leo in your, let's say in your ninth house, okay, or on your ninth house cusp, it's going to probably get you to read a book or two. It's going to light up the things of thinking, higher philosophy and religion and belief systems. It may lead you to, pay more attention to scripture, to belief structures that our society is being affected by at any given moment, right? Or at least in that period of the sun being in Leo. So, it may be the case that you're motivated to read more and to learn about religion, philosophy. You may be inspired to travel because the ninth house also deals with foreign travel. But it's foreign travel as to gain a cultural experience that you can really learn from. It's not just like travel to go have a margarita on a beach, right? If you have Leo on your ninth house cusp and covering your ninth house, you're going to be just very driven to like get out of the house, experience things, explore things, ideas, and even physical experiences that you can learn from, right? That's why it's associated with ninth house foreign travel, because when you visit another country, you're usually culture shocked and you have to like question certain ways of doing things, and you observe another culture's way of doing things and you learn something. All right. So it's higher learning. It's also about higher education in general, right? People who have a heavy emphasis on their ninth house in their birth chart, for example, if their sun is there, if they have lots of personal planets there, it typically means that they are grad school material. Not because they're more intelligent than anyone else, but because they have a preconditioned concern for things of the ninth house because their birth planets are there, right? So anyway, that's basically what the sun does when it travels through a house, like ninth house, for example. If that's where Leo is in your chart, the sun right now is lighting up the things of the ninth house. It's telling you, hey, pay attention to this area of life. Learn something, do something, experience something, take a lesson from it, you know? So yeah, house placement matters, right? So that's the sun. So what's the moon doing right now? The moon we're in a full moon phase, okay? A full moon always happens opposite the sun at any given time, because think about it, all right? My head is Earth. This is my head. It's Earth, okay? Not actually, but thank God. But in this little demo I'm doing, this is the sun in Leo. This is the moon in Aquarius, okay? They're opposite signs. So during a full moon, everyone gets a wee little external glimpse of what it's like to have sun opposite moon in the birth chart. Okay, that's why people make a big deal about this peak of the lunar season, about having this opposition in the sky, even if it doesn't represent an opposition in your own birth chart. Okay, it's still illuminating through the ego, through the sun, and through emotional processing, two opposite sides of your chart. Okay, so those two sides of the chart are both being made conscious at the same time. Now, opposite houses in a chart represent shadow topics, not just like shadow things internally, okay, but shadow topics of one another. So I talked about ninth house being higher learning, right? And grad school and foreign travel. Directly across from that is the third house. The third house represents domestic travel, lower learning, like early childhood learning, communication, right? And more relationships with siblings and early childhood peers. Could be cousins as well. It's people who you learn the basics of how to communicate with, you know, who you learn to socially interact with and use language to express ideas with. That's a much lower, more detailed level of learning than the ninth house directly across from it, which represents concepts. What do you learn in a grad school? If you're like in a good master's or PhD program, you learn about concepts, ideas, comparing conceptual ideas against one another and finding out what's logically most reasonable to believe, right? So a PhD, philosopher, doctor, or doctor of philosophy, you should be a thinker within the realm of whatever field you're pursuing that degree in, right? You relate concepts. So someone who's, you know, in whose chart the sun is going through, you know, the ninth house and the moon is in the third house simultaneously in this new moon situation, full moon situation, they're getting a glimpse of what it's like to have that feeling of tug of war happen between their ego and their energy source on one hand and their emotional processing and you know, how they think and feel about things and who they deeply are on the other hand. So sun is like your sense of self, your identity, what you more rationally think you are. The moon is deeply who you are because it's how you really think and feel and process things, you know. So during a full moon, people get a little glimpse of what it's like to have that opposition regarding the topics of whichever houses the sun and the moon are currently occupying within their birth chart at any given time. So one way you can look at this, if you don't know already, is you can go to astro.com. You can type in your birth chart information. You have to know your birth time because, again, you have to know where your ascendant is, because if you don't know where your ascendant is, you don't know how your houses and signs are aligned, and therefore you don't know where in your chart things are passing through in transit. So all this horoscope stuff we talk about is, useless. And go to astro.com and you can look at, open your birth chart and then click with transits, and then the green planets around your birth chart are going to land and make aspects with your birth planets, and it's going to show you where in your birth chart those current planets are actually ending up and affecting your psyche right here, right now. So go do that, and this will be the end of the stream. And I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.